It started with a whisper that should have been impossible. A ragged homeless boy leaning toward a grieving biker beside a grave and saying the words that would shatter everything he believed. "Your daughter isn't dead." The wind moved softly through the tall pines of Redwood Memorial Cemetery on the outskirts of Ridgewood, carrying the quiet smell of wet earth and rain as Daniel Hawk, Turner, stood alone before the polished marble headstone that bore the name of the only person who had ever truly mattered to him, his 19-year-old daughter, Emily Turner. And although the world saw Hawk as a towering leather-clad biker with scarred knuckles and a reputation that made strangers step aside when he walked into a room, at that moment, he looked like a man whose heart had been hollowed out and left behind in the ground beneath that stone, because 2 weeks earlier, the police had knocked on his garage door late at night and told him there had been an accident on Highway 17. A burning car pulled from a ravine, a body inside that was too damaged to recognize, and evidence that suggested the driver had been Emily. And although Hawk had demanded answers, demanded proof, demanded to see her himself, the officials had been quick, strangely quick, to close the case, explaining the fire had destroyed almost everything, and that identification had been confirmed through documents recovered from the car. So, a closed casket funeral was arranged, and the small crowd that gathered watched as the coffin, containing what they believed was Emily Turner, was lowered into the earth, while Hawk stood stiff and silent beside it, refusing to cry because somewhere deep inside him, something about the entire situation felt wrong. But grief had a way of burying questions beneath its weight, and after the funeral, the town slowly returned to its routines, while Hawk came back to this cemetery every evening, sitting beside the grave and talking quietly to the daughter who had once ridden on the back of his motorcycle, laughing into the wind. And on this particular evening, a grey drizzle blurred the horizon as Hawk knelt beside the grave marker, tracing the carved letters of Emily's name with rough fingertips when he suddenly sensed someone standing behind him, a small presence shifting nervously near the iron gate of the cemetery. And when Hawk turned, he saw a thin boy who looked no older than 12 with tangled brown hair, a torn hoodie several sizes too large, and a pair of worn sneakers barely holding together while he clutched a plastic grocery bag against his chest, as if it contained everything he owned. And the boy hesitated as their eyes met before finally stepping closer through the wet grass until he stood only a few feet away and whispered words so quietly they almost disappeared in the wind. "Sir, hey, a daughter isn't dead." And for a moment, Hawk thought he had misheard him because the sentence was so absurd it didn't belong in the world of reality. But the boy repeated it again, trembling slightly, as though he knew the risk of saying it. And Hawk slowly stood up to his full height, which made the child look even smaller by comparison, while a cold, dangerous edge crept into his voice as he asked, "Kid, that's not something you joke about." Yet, the boy shook his head quickly and said he wasn't joking, not at all, and that he had seen Emily with his own eyes only a few nights earlier, a claim that sent a sharp pulse through Hawk's chest, because Emily had been buried less than a week ago, and the impossible contradiction caused anger and hope to collide violently inside him as he demanded to know where this boy had supposedly seen her. But instead of answering immediately, the boy glanced nervously toward the road beyond the cemetery fence, as though expecting someone to be watching, before whispering that it happened down by the harbor near an abandoned warehouse where he sometimes slept to stay out of the rain, explaining that several nights earlier he had hidden behind a stack of shipping crates when a dock then pulled up and a group of men began unloading people who looked frightened and exhausted, and among them was a young woman with long brown hair, bruises on her arms, and a silver feather necklace hanging around her neck, who had briefly locked eyes with him through a gap in the crates before quietly slipping away from the man long enough to crouch beside him in the shadows and whisper a desperate message into his ear. If he ever managed to get away, he needed to find a biker called Hawk and tell him she was alive. And hearing that detail, the silver feather necklace made hot breath cash because it was a gift he had given Emily on her 18th birthday, and she had promised never to take it off. A promise she had kept every single day since. And suddenly the rain, the cemetery, and the grave marker in front of him all felt unreal as the possibility he had buried deep in his mind began clawing its way back to the surface while he crouched down to the boy's level and asked his name, to which the child quietly replied, "Leo," before explaining that he had waited several days to speak up because he had been scared the men from the warehouse might find him. But when he saw Hawk sitting by the grave again that afternoon, he realized the biker must be the father Emily had mentioned, and that he couldn't stay silent any longer. And Hawk studied the boy's face, searching for any sign of a lie, but found only fear and sincerity reflected in his wide eyes, the kind of truth that didn't need rehearsing. And in that moment, a terrifying thought formed in Hawk's mind. If Emily had truly been alive days after the accident, then the body buried beneath this headstone belonged to someone else, and someone somewhere had deliberately made sure the world believed Emily Turner was dead. A realization that sent a slow wave of fury through his veins as he looked back down at the grave before whispering to himself that if his daughter was alive out there somewhere, then he would tear the entire city apart until he found her. Because Hawk Turner might have been grieving yesterday, but tonight he had something far more dangerous driving him. Hope, the whisper from the homeless boy, should have sounded impossible. Yet, as Daniel Hawk Turner rode his motorcycle through the dark streets of Ridgewood that night, the words echoed louder in his mind with every mile. "Your daughter isn't dead." And the more he replayed them, the more the official story of Emily's death began to unravel in ways that made his stomach twist with suspicion. Because from the very beginning, something about the accident had felt rushed and strangely quiet, almost as if the authorities had wanted the entire situation closed and buried before anyone could ask too many questions. And now, Hawk found himself gripping the handlebars tighter as he sped toward his garage on the edge of town. Rain streaking across the chrome of his bike, while the engine roared through the empty streets like a warning that something powerful had just been awakened. Because grief had kept him silent for 2 weeks, but hope was turning that silence into something far more dangerous. When he finally pulled into the wide gravel lot behind his garage, the place was dimly lit by a flickering security lamp, and a few members of his motorcycle club, the Iron Saints, were already inside working on bikes or drinking coffee around the scarred wooden table that served D as their unofficial meeting spot. But the moment Hawk walked through the door, their conversation stopped because they immediately saw the change in his expression. The grief that had weighed on him since Emily's funeral had been replaced by a sharp focus none of them had seen in years, and after a long moment, one of the older riders named Marcus set his mud down and asked quietly, "Hawk, what happened?" To which Hawk responded by pulling out a chair and telling them everything the boy from the cemetery had said, every word, every detail about the van, the frightened people, and the young woman with the silver feather necklace who had whispered his name. And as he spoke, the room slowly filled with a tense silence, because every one of the men in that garage had known Emily since she was a child. They remembered her riding around the parking lot on a tiny dirt bike, while Hawk chased behind her, pretending to be angry when she rode too fast. They remembered her helping them wash motorcycles on summer afternoons, and none of them had believed the official story about the accident felt right. But grief had made them accept it anyway, until now. When Hawk finished speaking, he looked around the room and said in a low voice that if the boy Leo was telling the truth, then Emily might still be alive somewhere in the harbor district. And if that was the case, then someone had deliberately staged the accident to make her disappear, which meant the situation was bigger than a simple kidnapping and possibly far more dangerous than any of them wanted to imagine. Yet, not a single rider in the room hesitated because loyalty ran deep among the Iron Saints, and the idea that someone had taken Hawk's daughter, someone they had watched grow up, filled them with the same quiet fury building in Hawk's chest. So Marcus leaned forward and asked the one question everyone was thinking. Where do we start? And Hawk answered immediately that before they stormed into the harbor, They needed to confirm something first, the accident itself. Because if Emily had really been alive days after the crash, then the body buried in the grave wasn't hers. And that meant someone had falsified the identification or hidden evidence, which led Hawk to pull out his phone and call an old friend named Carl, who worked at the county, toward where damaged vehicles from accidents were stored. A man who owed Hawk a favor from years ago. And when Carl answered, Hawk kept his voice calm as he asked if the burned car from Emily Turner's crash was still in the impound lot, to which Carl replied that it was scheduled to be destroyed in a few days, but was still sitting in storage for the moment. And when Hawk asked if Carl had personally seen the body that had been found inside the vehicle, there was a long pause on the line before Carl admitted something that made every rider in the garage lean closer to hear. He hadn't seen it clearly because the fire had been intense and most of the investigation had been handled quickly by outside officials who arrived before the local police even finished processing the scene. And according to Carl, the paperwork for the case had been sealed unusually fast, almost like someone with authority wanted it closed before the details spread around town. And hearing the confirmation sent a cold certainty through Hawk's mind that the boy Leo might actually be telling the truth, because accidents didn't get locked down that quickly unless someone powerful wanted the truth hidden. So Hawk ended the call and looked at the men around the table before saying quietly that they were heading to the Tord right now. And within minutes, engines roared to life as a line of motorcycles tore through the sleeping streets toward the outskirts of Ridgewood, where the fence. D-lots stretched across several acres of gravel filled with wrecked vehicles, waiting to be scrapped. And when they arrived, Carl nervously unlocked the gate and led Hawk to the far corner where the burned sedan from the crash still sat beneath the tarp. The metal frame twisted and blackened from the fire, while the windows had melted into warped glass puddles. And as Hawk pulled the tarp away, a strange silence settled over the group. Because, even from the outside, something about the wreck looked wrong. The driver's door showed almost no damage compared to the rest of the car, and the steering wheel had barely been scorched, despite the intensity of the blaze that had supposedly consumed the interior. Details that made Marcus mutter that the fire might have started after the crash instead of during it, which meant someone could have placed a body inside afterward. And that possibility made Hawk's chest tighten as he slowly walked around the vehicle until he noticed something half buried beneath the passenger seat. A small metallic object that glinted faintly under the lot's overhead lights. And when he reached inside and pulled it free, he found himself holding a broken cell phone with a cracked screen. Emily's phone case, the one with the faded mountain sticker she had put on it years earlier. But the device was empty, the battery removed, as if someone had deliberately wiped it before leaving it behind as part of the scene, and that single detail confirmed what Hawk had already begun to believe. The crash had been staged. The death had been faked, and his daughter had been taken somewhere against her will, which meant every minute they wasted was another minute Emily might be trapped in whatever nightmare Leo had glimpsed at the harbor warehouse. So Hawk closed his fist around the broken phone and looked toward the distant glow of the river district before saying the words that would set everything in motion. We ride to the harbor tonight. Because somewhere in those dark warehouses, his daughter might still be waiting for him to come. The truth waiting inside the harbor warehouse would change Daniel Hawk Turner's life forever. But as the line of motorcycles thundered through the quiet industrial district just before midnight, he still didn't know whether he was riding toward a miracle or toward the final confirmation that hope had been nothing more than a cruel illusion. Because the broken phone he had pulled from the burned car made one thing painfully clear: someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to fake Emily. Turner's death, and people who created lies that big rarely allowed their secrets to survive. Yet Hawk refused to slow down as the glowing lights of the riverfront warehouses appeared ahead through the darkness. The old docks, silent except for the distant sound of water slapping against rusted metal pilings, while the Iron Saints rode in a tight formation behind him. their engines echoing through the empty streets until Hawk finally lifted a hand, and the group rolled quietly into the shadows of an abandoned shipping yard, where they cut their engines and coasted the last few yards toward the building. Leo had described a long concrete warehouse sitting beside the river, with broken windows and a collapsed loading ramp that made the place look deserted at first glance. But Hawk immediately noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Fresh tire tracks cutting through the mud near the side entrance, the kind that came from a heavy van, and he pointed them out to Marcus, who nodded silently before whispering that someone had definitely been using the building recently, which meant Leo's story was already proving true. The riders moved carefully now, boots crunching softly over gravel as they spread out along the dark walls of the warehouse until Hawk reached a cracked side door that hung slightly open, a faint yellow light spilling through the gap along with the low murmur of voices inside. And for a moment, Hawk closed his eyes and took a slow breath because he knew whatever waited beyond that door could change everything. But then he pushed it open and stepped inside with the others, following close behind. And the scene that unfolded before them made several of the hardened bikers freeze in disbelief, because the warehouse was not empty at all. Rows of metal cages lined the far wall, and inside those cages sat frightened young men and women with exhausted faces, some clutching blankets while others stared silently at the floor, as though they had long ago stopped believing rescue was possible. While across the open space a pair of men stood beside a folding table, counting stacks of cash under a hanging work light, clearly not expecting a group of bikers to suddenly walk through the door. In the moment one of them noticed Hawk, the man shouted something in panic while reaching toward his belt, but he never finished the movement because Marcus and two other riders rushed forward and tackled him before he could grab whatever weapon he carried, while the second guard tried to run for the back exit, only to be intersected by another rider who slammed him against a support beam and pinned him there. And in the sudden chaos, several of the people inside the cages began crying out for help, the noise echoing through the cavernous warehouse while Hawk's attention darted desperately across the room, searching for one face among dozens, his heart pounding harder with every second, because if Emily wasn't here, then the last fragile thread of hope might snap completely, until he heard a familiar voice call out from somewhere deeper inside the building. Weak but unmistakable, Dad, and the sound hit Hawk like a shock of electricity as he spun toward the far corner, where a smaller cage sat partially hidden behind stacked crates. And there, through the dim light, he saw her, Emily Turner, 19 years old, bruised and exhausted, but very much alive, gripping the metal bars while tears streamed down her face. And for a split second, Hawk couldn't move because the sight felt unreal after weeks of believing she was gone forever. But then he crossed the distance in a few long strides and pulled the cage door open after one of the riders smashed the cheap lock with a wrench. And the moment Emily stepped out, Hawk wrapped his arms around her so tightly she could barely breathe, while the two of them stood there trembling with relief as the nightmare finally cracked open around them. After several seconds, Emily pulled back slightly and explained in a shaky voice that she had been driving home from a friend's house, the night of the accident when a van forced her car off the road on a deserted stretch of highway. And before she could escape, two men dragged her out while another set her car on fire with a container of gasoline to make it look like she had died in the crash. Then they drove her to the harbor, where she discovered dozens of other people were being held before being secretly transported across state lines. Part of a trafficking operation that used staged accidents and falsified police reports to make victims disappear without raising suspicion. A scheme so carefully planned that even local investigators often believed the deaths were real. And as Emily finished explaining, the distant wail of sirens suddenly filled the night because one of the Iron Saints had already called federal authorities after seeing the cages, which meant the people responsible would soon face more than just a group of angry bikers. And within minutes, flashing red and blue lights flooded the world. Our house as law. Enforcement vehicles arrived to take control of the scene, while paramedics rushed to help the rescued captives, many of whom had been missing for weeks. But through all the chaos, Hawk barely noticed anything except the fact that his daughter was standing beside him alive, her hand gripping his sleeve, as if she was afraid he might vanish if she let go. And when investigators later asked how the entire operation had been discovered, Hawk simply glanced toward the doorway where a small figure stood. Nervously watching the scene, the homeless boy, Leo, who had followed the bikers from a distance to make sure Hawk actually came. And Hawk placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder before saying quietly that the real hero of the night wasn't a biker at all, but a kid who refused to ignore the truth. Because if Leo had stayed silent, Emily Turner and many others might have disappeared forever. And as dawn began to creep over the river hours later, Hawk stood outside the warehouse with Emily beside him, realizing that the grave he had been visiting every evening now held nothing but a lie that had merely stolen the most important person in his life. Yet, thanks to one brave whisper in a cemetery, the truth had finally come roaring back to